When you read the title, it seems like a fable. The type of fisherman's story that you would laugh off while drinking a warm beer. Man survives 3 hours inside a crocodile's jaws. This, however, is not a legend. This is the tale of Luca, a fisherman who lives in a little town on the banks of the Grumeti River, and the 3 hours that he spent in the most terrible location on the planet. Neither was it a gigantic crocodile that broke all previous records. It was a Nile crocodile of 4 meters in length, a predator that had been perfected over the course of 200 million years of development. As the sun began to set, Luca was inspecting his nets with the water softly lapping against his dugout boat. The assault was not a spectacular thrust. Rather, it was an eruption of intense ferocity from the beginning of time. On the one hand, he was standing straight, and on the other, a force that was comparable to a car accident gripped his lower body. At that point the world disappeared into a swirl of pressure, water, and darkness. He was ensnared between the jaws of the crocodile. When Luca first became aware of anything, it was not pain, but rather pressure. Both his legs and his chest were held down by a massive and crushing weight. This live vise was made up of dozens of conical teeth that were not designed for slicing, but rather for holding. He was unable to move and was unable to breathe. Once the crocodile had successfully taken its food, it proceeded to do what its kind has always done. It started to do a death roll. On the other hand, Luca's survival started during that first chaotic spin. Instinctively, he did something that very few people are capable of doing, become a limp. He did not attempt to resist the roll. Rather, he moved in tandem with it, so decreasing the tension that would have otherwise caused his flesh to rip and his bones to fracture. In the midst of the world's collapse, his intellect, which was heightened by adrenaline, made an important observation. Although the crocodile's biting power was enormous, the muscles that allowed it to open its jaws were in a shocking state of weakness. He had just experienced his first glimmer of optimism. After the rolling came to an end, the crocodile sank into the water and held him until he was completely buried. Luca's familiarity with the area proved to be his savior at this turn of events. He was aware that crocodiles had a palatal valve, which is a flap of tissue located at the back of their throat that prevents it from being exposed to water. This enables them to drown their prey while ensuring that their own lungs remain healthy. With his upper torso still in the crocodile's mouth, but not yet in its throat, Luca discovered a small air pocket in the inside of the animal's mouth. In spite of the fact that it smelled like rotting flesh and reptiles, it was air. In an attempt to breathe, he placed his face on the roof of the crocodile's mouth, and his nose found a little gap to fit through. He then took weak, frantic breaths. The time had come for the mental battle to begin. After the immediate effect of shock had worn off, a chilling and claustrophobic anxiety had taken its place. The only noises that could be heard were the low-frequency gurgles of the reptile and the rapid pounding of his own heart. They were the only sounds that could be heard. With every little movement of the creature's mouth, he was able to sense the vast strength that it had. This was a startling realization for Luca, who realized that the crocodile no longer considered him to be a man, but rather a nuisance. It was impossible to swallow him due to his size. The crocodile's approach consisted of patience, which included drowning him, allowing him to get more frail, and waiting for him to pass away. Luca made the decision to be the most inconvenient and inedible source of difficulty that this crocodile had ever experienced. His response was not one of overwhelming might, but rather one of focused annoyance. He started fighting back. In order to squeeze and poke into the delicate tissue that was around the crocodile's eyes, he used his thumbs, which were his strongest digit. He wriggled, not with the intention of escaping, but rather to be an obnoxious and disagreeable lump. The fact that even the most dangerous predators choose a simple meal was the basic truth that he was banking his life on. The onset of fatigue occurred. The force exerted on his body was causing harm to his internal organs. Dehydration and hypoxia started to cause his thinking to become muddled. In the fight, he was falling behind. In an attempt to save himself, he recalled an old villager's story, which said that it is possible to convince a crocodile to let go of its hold by striking its tongue, which is the most sensitive organ in the animal. In order to drive his hand further into the mouth, Luca summoned a store of power that he was unaware he had. He extended his hand beyond his own body. The soft, muscular slab of the tongue was located by him, and he sank his fingers into it. ripping and scraping it with all of his might. Almost immediately, the response took place. The crocodile went into a convulsion because it was feeling a pain that it had never felt before inside its own jaws. Although it was just for a fraction of a second, its jaws relaxed. It was the only opportunity that Luca would ever have. It was a jumble of puncture wounds and bruises all over his body as he emerged from the water, gasping for oxygen in the fresh night-evening air, after being frightened and perplexed by the unexpected movement. As well as the peculiar and excruciating prey, the crocodile just let him go and slipped back into the inside of the cave. The return of Luca to the community was not a victorious parade, but rather a spectral arrival. His body was a canvas of purple bruises and severe, precise puncture wounds, and he was brought in on a stretcher and carried in. The local healer, a lady called Amina, who was knowledgeable about the intricacies of poultices and bones, subsequently said that the pattern of teeth on his chest and legs was a precise map of the crocodile's mouth, a terrible fossil engraved into live flesh. As Tim went on, the initial wonder that he had survived was quickly replaced by a quiet superstition. In a society in which the river serves as both a deity and a provider, Luca was suddenly considered out of the ordinary. Specifically, he was the one who had been spat out by the river god after being tasted by him. Did he have a blessing or a curse? Did he feel the presence of death at this moment, or had he taken life from the very mouth of death? When he hobbled by, children would gaze at him with wide, apprehensive eyes, and even friends would sometimes become quiet after he passed by. A miracle was verified by the doctors working in the hospital located in the faraway city. Even though his injuries were severe, they were completely unaffected by surgery. Major arteries were not cut in any way. There was no piercing of any important organs. It was almost as if the crocodile had been crafted with the intention of not immediately killing him, but rather holding him. "You weren't bitten," a doctor who was shocked to see the x-rays informed him as he explained the situation. "You were contained." Nevertheless, the mending of the body was the simple part. The evenings were the true test of one's will. When he was dreaming, the atmosphere would grow as thick as water. The darkness would close in, and the deep gurgling rumble of the crocodile's digestive tract would become the soundtrack of his subconscious. When he would wake up, Keone, his wife, would be holding him while her own face was covered with tears. He would be writhing, his mind maybe sent into a state of fear by the odor of decaying fish or the unexpected, warm moisture of a rain shower. This would cause his thoughts to hurtle back into that reptile mouth. It had been a year. A persistent stiffness in his leg prevented Luca from walking again, but he was able to walk again. Despite the fact that the nightmares had subsided, a terrible sense of restlessness had taken their place. As a guy who was living on borrowed time that he did not know how to use, he had the sensation of being a ghost in his own life. It was one morning that he decided to wander down to the riverside without informing anybody else. It flowed. The Grumetti, as indifferent and magnificent as it had always been. Residents of the community stood at a distance and observed him while holding their breath. As a result, they anticipated that he would curse the river, fling stones, and ultimately drive out the demon that resided in that location. Luca, on the other hand, did not engage in them, and there he was, standing at the precise site where his boat had capsized, his feet sinking into the muck that he had been acquainted with. He did not experience hate, but rather a peculiar and terrible affinity. He had been inside the most classified location in this ecosystem, which was the living engine of the most dangerous predator in the environment. Having experienced its strength, he was also aware of its limits. It was by a mix of chance, instinct, and understanding that he was able to break out of the food chain, which he had previously been a member of. When he glanced at the water, he saw that it was no longer only a menace. In front of him was a system that was very intricate and old. Indeed, the crocodile was not a monstrous creature. Rather, it was an ideal representation of that system. It had no malicious intent, but rather a sole, ruthless aim. Luca had ultimately come to appreciate it, but he was unable to adequately describe how he felt about it. Luca did not go back to practicing fishing. In its place, he transformed into something else. At one point, the youngsters were terrified, but now they were clustered around him, their curiosity triumphing over their dread. It was a question that a little kid would ask. "Luca, did it really taste you?" Luca would respond with a deep grunt. Yes, as he often did. I was able to taste it. The mouth of the creature resembled old leather, and the dirt at the beginning of the river was quite deep. He became the living history of the river in the hamlet, not only on the subject of its hazards, but also on the subject of its rhythms and its equilibrium. He taught the young hunters how to read the water, not only for the indicators of prey, but also for the signs of the crocodile, such as the very imperceptible wake and the log-like stillness of the aquatic environment. He did not refer to the palatal valve as a biological truth. Crater. He referred to it as the river god's door, which was something that he needed to comprehend in order to make his way back into the world. There was a difference between the guy who survived and the man who was assaulted. The previous version of Luca was devoured by their jaws. The guy who emerged was more placid and weighed down by his wealth of information. He had seen the world from the perspective of a myth, and he had discovered that the boundary between life and death is as thin as the flap of tissue that is located at the back of a crocodile's neck. At this point, his survival was no longer only a tale of a struggle. This was a short story, a reminder that in order to coexist with the wild, one must comprehend it, appreciate its ultimate strength, and be aware of the fact that sometimes survival is not about winning a fight, but rather about comprehending the laws of the conflict to such an extent that one may locate the one solitary, insurmountable loophole. He was not successful in overcoming the crocodile. He had engaged in compromise with it. As a result of his actions, the bond that existed between his people and the old and mighty river that provided them with sustenance was irrevocably altered permanently.